On a chilly November evening, as the street lamps flickered against the early darkness, Ava, a 15-year-old with wide, apprehensive eyes, entered Mr. Johnson's grocery store. She was dressed in an oversized coat, too large for her thin frame, with the hood drawn low. This wasn't her first time in the store. She'd been slipping in regularly, always lingering longer than most customers, her gaze darting between canned goods and fresh bread. And tonight, with trembling hands, she did something she'd never dared before. She slid a loaf of bread beneath her coat, heart pounding like thunder in her ears. Behind the counter, Mr. Johnson observed her through the dim light, tall and stoic, with a few strands of gray streaking his short, dark hair. He had a presence that commanded quiet respect. For years, he'd kept a steady routine in his shop, familiar with every face in this modest neighborhood. Tonight, though, he noticed something strange. Ava, usually hesitant, had a look of quiet desperation. Suddenly, as Ava stepped toward the exit, her shoulders stiff and breath shallow, Mr. Johnson's voice cut through the silence. "Young lady, where are you going with that?" She froze mid-step, every nerve on edge. Turning slowly, Ava faced him, her face pale. I didn't mean to. I just..." Her voice broke as she clutched the bread tighter. She said nothing more but seemed to shrink under his gaze. Mr. Johnson's eyes softened just a little. He knew this look, the same one he'd seen staring back at him in a mirror years ago. But he wasn't one for sentimental tale. "Come with me," he said, his tone even, nodding toward the back office. As he led her down the narrow hallway to a cramped room filled with scattered paperwork and an old desk, he expected Ava to cry or apologize, maybe even beg. But her silence puzzled him, and as she sank into the chair across from him, her head hung low, he felt a strange mixture of curiosity and concern. Ava sat in silence, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the bread. Finally, in a low voice, she muttered, "It's my mom. She's sick. I had to get something for my brother and sister." She took a shuddering breath, her words tumbling out, and Mr. Johnson could see she was fighting to keep her composure. For a long moment, Mr. Johnson said nothing. He sat, watching the girl who had barely said a word all these months. And now here she was, admitting something she clearly hadn't wanted to say to anyone. "So," he finally said, crossing his arms, "what would you have done if you hadn't been caught?" Ava looked up, her dark eyes brimming with a mixture of anger and shame. "I would have brought it back, once things were better." Her voice was barely a whisper, but her tone was fierce. "I wasn't trying to get away with it." A small silence filled the room, tense but not unkind. Mr. Johnson leaned back, studying her with a critical eye. In his mind, he recalled his own childhood, flashes of empty cupboards, the endless sound of his mother's strained breathing as she worked double shifts. But no, this girl didn't need to know that. He had long since buried those memories, locked them away behind a stern exterior. Yet something in Ava's voice, her determination, made him pause. "Tell you what," he said, surprising himself as much as her. "You can take the bread, but I want you back here tomorrow at 5 p.m. sharp. We're not just handing out freebies. I'll find something you can do to earn it." Ava's eyes widened, her mouth parting in shock. She searched his face, almost as if waiting for the punchline to a cruel joke, but Mr. Johnson's expression remained steady, unreadable. A flicker of relief crossed her face as she nodded slowly. I'll be here." Before she left, he held her back one more time. "But don't expect charity. You'll work for everything you take." Before we dive into this amazing story, let's connect. Tell us where you're watching from and what inspires you most about stories like this. We can't wait to read your comments and hear your thoughts. Ava returned the next day, as promised, just before dusk. The store felt quieter than usual, though a few customers still roamed the aisles. Mr. Johnson saw her right away. He'd been watching the clock, wondering if she'd show up at all. She wore the same oversized coat, her hands shoved deep into the pockets, but there was a look of determination on her face that he couldn't ignore. "Good. You're on time," he said without offering a smile or a nod of approval. "Follow me." He led her to the back storage area, where tall shelves held boxes of canned goods, bags of flour, and bottles of cleaning supplies. The air was thick with the faint scent of cardboard and detergent, the familiar smells of a stockroom that barely changed with the seasons. "You'll start by sorting these," he told her, gesturing to a pile of boxes marked new stock. "I want them unpacked and put on the shelves neatly. Got it?" Ava nodded, though he noticed the flicker of doubt in her eyes as she looked at the large stack of boxes. She didn't say anything, just rolled up her sleeves and got to work, her hands moving with a quiet resolve that caught him off guard. An hour passed, then two, and Mr. Johnson found himself glancing into the storeroom more than once. Ava was focused, silent, working as though she'd done this 100 times before. Her hands were small but steady, each can and bottle placed on the shelf with careful precision. He hadn't expected this. He'd assumed she'd complain or at least drag her feet, but here she was, committed to earning that loaf of bread. As the last box was emptied and the shelves looked immaculate, Ava wiped her brow, glancing around for him. I think I'm done," she said, her voice hesitant. Mr. Johnson nodded approvingly, though he kept his expression neutral. "Good. Now go home." He handed her a small bag with a few more essentials. A can of soup, some pasta, another loaf of bread. She stared at it, stunned. "But I didn't work for all this." "Consider it credit," he replied curtly, and turned back to his desk before she could argue. Ava hesitated but took the bag, a small, grateful smile tugging at her lips. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Ava would arrive at the store every afternoon, right after school, working quietly in the stockroom or sweeping the aisles. She asked for nothing, never once mentioned her situation at home. But Mr. Johnson could see the strain in her eyes. Some days her steps seemed heavier, her shoulders slumped, but still she never complained. There was a resilience in her that he found himself respecting. Then one Friday, as Ava was organizing some shelves, the door swung open and a tall, thin boy around her age stepped in, looking lost. Mr. Johnson watched with curiosity as Ava's face lit up. "Ben," she whispered, glancing around as if unsure whether to feel excited or wary. Ben, her younger brother, had come to check on her, though he hesitated near the doorway, casting nervous glances at Mr. Johnson. Ava quickly introduced him, explaining that he'd come to walk her home. "Our mom, she worries," Ben explained, shuffling his feet. His voice was soft but filled with a maturity that Mr. Johnson hadn't expected. Mr. Johnson simply nodded, and for a moment he wondered what it must be like for the two of them, children really, forced to carry so much responsibility. He watched them leave together, a pang of something unfamiliar stirring within him. The following Monday, Ava arrived a little later than usual, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't offer any explanation, but as she quietly unpacked the boxes, Mr. Johnson felt an urge he hadn't felt in years, a need to ask, to understand. Finally, he broke the silence. "Is everything all right?" She looked at him, startled, as though the question was something she hadn't expected. She bit her lip and nodded, but her hands shook as she arranged the cans on the shelf. "It's just my mom," she finally whispered. "She's not getting better. The bills are piling up and I don't know how long." She trailed off, swallowing hard, clearly fighting to keep herself together. Mr. Johnson's heart clenched. He wanted to offer words of comfort, but found himself speechless. It wasn't his place to get involved, he reminded himself. Yet that night, as he closed up the store, he found himself unable to shake the memory of Ava's face, her quiet strength, her fear. Days passed, and one evening, as Ava was finishing her work, Mr. Johnson pulled out an old cell phone from his desk drawer. It was a spare, something he'd kept tucked away in case of emergency. "Here," he said gruffly, holding it out to her. "Take this. You can call if you need anything." Ava looked up, surprised, her eyes wide. Why would you give me this?" He shrugged, looking away. "Can't have you disappearing on me. You've become my best worker after all." His tone was blunt, but she understood the meaning behind it. She nodded, accepting the phone with quiet gratitude. One cold December evening, as the store was closing, Ava came rushing in, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Mr. Johnson," she gasped, clutching her coat tight, her voice barely steady. "My mom, she collapsed. I don't know what to do." Mr. Johnson didn't hesitate. "Let's go." Before she could process his words, he grabbed his coat and keys, guiding her outside and into his car. As they drove, Ava sat silently, holding back tears. And for the first time, Mr. Johnson found himself wondering how long she'd carried this burden alone. When they reached her house, he helped her inside, where her mother lay on the couch, her breathing shallow and labored. He waited with her that night, long after the paramedics had come and gone, offering only quiet support as she sat, shoulders hunched, by her mother's side. As dawn broke, Mr. Johnson felt the weight of his own past, the hardships, the loneliness, like a shadow beside him. Before he left, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Ava. Remember that." His voice was gruff, but she heard the sincerity in his words. For the first time, Ava allowed herself to lean on someone, if only a little, her head nodding as she whispered, "Thank you." She didn't look up, but he saw a tear slip down her cheek, a small crack in her otherwise steely resolve. This was only the beginning of something neither of them expected, a connection that would change them both in ways they hadn't yet begun to realize. The days after Ava's mother's collapse were a blur of stress and uncertainty. Mr. Johnson had become more than a boss. He was a pillar of strength for Ava, who now seemed thinner and more exhausted each time she came into the store. He noticed her worry deepen, and one evening, after the last customer had left, he couldn't hold back his concern any longer. "Ava, you don't look well. This job isn't everything. If you need to take time off, I'll understand," he said, his voice as gentle as he could make it. Ava shook her head firmly, her eyes glistening. "I need this job. I need to help Mom with the bills, and Ben, he needs new shoes. I can't just stop." She lowered her gaze, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter as if anchoring herself. It was then that Mr. Johnson realized just how deeply entrenched Ava was in her family's struggles. He felt a pang of guilt for the times he'd doubted her resilience, for assuming she'd break under the pressure. But Ava was unyielding, determined, and yet he knew she couldn't keep this up alone. As much as he wanted to stay uninvolved, something within him was shifting. Memories of his own mother's struggles, her sacrifices, haunted him each time he looked at Ava. The following week, just before Ava's shift, Mr. Johnson sat in his office, staring at the old photograph he kept hidden in his desk. It was a picture of his mother, her warm smile contrasting sharply with the worn look in her eyes. Memories flooded back, times when he was young, struggling, just like Ava and her family. He knew he couldn't let her bear this burden alone. His decision, though difficult, felt right. That evening, as Ava clocked in, Mr. Johnson called her into his office. "Sit down," he said, his voice solemn. She sat, her expression wary. "I've been thinking about your situation," he began, trying to find the right words. "I want to help, Ava. Not just with this job, but with everything." She looked at him, confused. "I don't understand. You've already helped so much. I can't ask for more." "You didn't ask," he replied, his voice firmer than usual. "This is me offering. Your family shouldn't be in this alone." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his own words. "I've been where you are. I know what it's like to have nothing. To feel like every small setback could mean, well, everything." Ava's eyes widened as she listened, realization dawning on her. She'd never seen Mr. Johnson as anything other than a stern shopkeeper. But now, for the first time, he seemed human. A person with a past, with secrets of his own. And those secrets, she sensed, had scars. "Mr. Johnson, why are you doing this for us?" she whispered, barely able to contain the tremble in her voice. He paused, weighing his answer carefully. "Because sometimes we have to help others, even if it stirs up old memories we'd rather forget." Just then, the door creaked open, and Ben stepped in, his face pale, eyes wide with panic. "Ava!" he gasped, clutching her arm. "It's Mom. She's gotten worse. I don't know what to do. She's not waking up." Without a second thought, Mr. Johnson grabbed his coat, instructing Ben to stay close. He drove them to the hospital, barely speaking. His jaw set as he maneuvered through the streets. Ava sat beside him, her hands clenched in her lap, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. Her mind was a storm of worry, but something about Mr. Johnson's presence kept her from falling apart entirely. She sensed that no matter what happened, she wouldn't face it alone.
Hey there, quick message. Grab a paper, write down HeroKind Stories, our channel name. Come back soon, we've got incredible stories you won't want to miss.
They reached the hospital, where the nurse informed them that Ava's mother had been admitted for a critical condition. Her illness, worsened by the lack of proper care and the constant stress, had finally taken its toll. Ava felt her heart sink, and for the first time, she looked at Mr. Johnson, the fear evident in her eyes. "They said she might not make it through the night," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Johnson felt the weight of her words, his own heart constricting painfully. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, grounding her with the only comfort he could offer. "Let's go see her," he said quietly. Inside the small, dim hospital room, Ava's mother lay on the bed, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Ava walked to her side, taking her mother's hand, her own trembling as she fought to keep her composure. She glanced back at Mr. Johnson, who stood quietly by the door, giving her the space she needed. As Ava sat by her mother's side, Mr. Johnson found himself lost in thought. He'd always kept his past hidden, even from himself. But watching Ava with her mother forced him to confront memories he'd buried long ago. His mother, too, had been a fighter, a woman who'd sacrificed everything for her children. But unlike Ava, he'd been alone back then, with no one to rely on. A nurse entered the room, her expression grim as she pulled Mr. Johnson aside. "She'll need long-term care," she said quietly. "The family is young. They may not have the resources. Do you know if there's anyone who can help?" The words struck him deeply. He'd held himself apart from Ava's struggles, seeing them as a temporary inconvenience. But now, he realized he was in a unique position to make a difference. Ava's resilience, her determination to hold her family together, mirrored his own past so closely that he couldn't ignore it any longer. Mr. Johnson made a decision in that moment, one he hadn't anticipated but felt in his core was right. Returning to Ava's side, he gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "I have an idea," he said softly. She looked up at him, weary but listening. "There are resources. I know some people who can help, and if it's all right with you, I'd like to offer support for you, your mom, and your brother. I know it's a lot to take in, but it's my choice." Ava's lip quivered as she fought back tears. "But why?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread. "You've already done so much." Mr. Johnson looked away, his gaze distant. "Because sometimes, when you've had to face the worst alone, you don't want anyone else to go through it. Not when you can help." They arranged for Ava's mother to receive the care she needed, with Mr. Johnson offering his financial assistance for the first few months. It was more than Ava had ever dared to hope for, and as she watched her mother begin the road to recovery, her gratitude grew, along with a fierce determination to pay back his kindness. But the bond between them was no longer that of a boss and his employee. It was a shared understanding, a bridge between two people who'd both seen life's hardships, but had emerged with a determination to help others. For Mr. Johnson, this connection was as surprising as it was healing. And for Ava, it became a lifeline she hadn't realized she needed. A week later, as her mother rested at home and Ben helped with chores, Ava returned to the store. Mr. Johnson was there, sorting stock, but he looked up when she entered, a quiet pride in his eyes. "Back to work already?" he asked, feigning a gruffness that both knew was no longer real. Ava smiled, her expression filled with gratitude. "I wanted to thank you for everything." Mr. Johnson simply nodded. "No need to thank me. Just make something of it, for yourself and for your family." She nodded, understanding his words on a deeper level. This was more than a gift. It was a challenge, a responsibility. She was no longer alone, but she also had a purpose: to rise above her circumstances, to give her family a future, and perhaps one day, to offer others the same kindness that had changed her own life. As winter turned to spring, Ava's life transformed in ways she hadn't thought possible. With Mr. Johnson's steady support and her mother's health slowly improving, Ava found herself no longer consumed by constant worry. The shadows that had once hung over her family seemed to lighten, replaced by cautious optimism. But Ava knew, deep down, that she couldn't rely on Mr. Johnson's generosity forever. She was determined to carve out a future for her family, on her terms. Returning to school with renewed focus, Ava also took on a few more shifts at Mr. Johnson's store. She'd once thought of the shop as merely a place to work, a necessity to get by, but now it felt like more. It was a haven, a place where she had discovered both her own resilience and the unexpected kindness of a stranger who had, in many ways, become family. One afternoon, as she stocked shelves in the store, Mr. Johnson called her over. She noticed he was holding a small stack of papers, which he handed to her with an almost shy expression. "Take a look at these," he said, nodding toward the documents. Ava glanced down, her brows furrowing as she read the heading: Community Scholarship Application. Her eyes shot back up to meet his, surprise mingled with hope. "Mr. Johnson, I don't know what to say." "Just fill it out," he replied gruffly, clearing his throat. "There's a chance you'll qualify, and it could mean college for you. I thought you might want that." She swallowed hard, a wave of emotions catching her off guard. No one had ever suggested college before. It had always been a distant dream, something she'd never dared voice aloud. "You really think I could?" He nodded, his expression serious. "I know you can. You've proven you're not afraid of hard work. You deserve a chance at something more." There was a pause, and then he added, his voice soft, "I missed my chance, but I'm not letting you miss yours." Over the following weeks, Ava completed her application, and with Mr. Johnson's guidance, submitted it. As they waited for a response, he encouraged her to keep learning at the store: basic accounting, stock management, customer service. He'd never realized how much he'd come to rely on her until he watched her handle each task with quiet confidence. She reminded him so much of himself, but with a strength that ran even deeper. One early morning in April, the letter arrived. Ava's hands shook as she tore it open, reading the words again and again before rushing to the store to share the news with Mr. Johnson. She burst through the doors, her face lit up with a smile he had rarely seen. "I got it!" she cried, her voice trembling with joy. "They gave me the scholarship!" For a moment, Mr. Johnson simply looked at her, his own emotions a mixture of pride and something far more profound. "Well, I never doubted you," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. They shared a rare, quiet hug, a bond formed through hardship and understanding, a relationship that had saved them both in ways they hadn't realized. Months later, as Ava prepared to start her first semester, she visited the store one last time before leaving for school. She found Mr. Johnson stocking shelves, and as she watched him, she felt a wave of gratitude for the man who had come to mean so much to her. "Will you be okay without me?" she teased, grinning as she reached for a nearby can, arranging it on the shelf beside him. Mr. Johnson chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll manage, but this place won't be the same without you, kid." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind of laughter that spoke of memories, hardships, and small victories. As she stood there, Ava realized that her time at the store had given her more than just food and a paycheck. It had given her confidence, a sense of purpose, and most of all, someone who believed in her when no one else did. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." He met her gaze, his expression softening. "Just promise me one thing," he said. "Don't forget where you come from. And when the time comes, help someone else the way you were helped." Ava nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "I promise." The store felt different after Ava left. A little emptier, a little quieter. Mr. Johnson returned to his routines, but something had shifted within him. Helping Ava had brought him out of the shadows of his past, healing old wounds he hadn't realized were still open. And as spring settled into summer, he found himself looking out for others in his community, offering small acts of kindness, quietly but intentionally. Ava had reminded him of the power of a single gesture, a helping hand, and he intended to keep that spirit alive. One day, as he was closing the store, he found a letter slipped under the door. It was from Ava. She wrote about her classes, the friends she was making, and how she hoped to come home to visit soon. At the end of the letter, she added a simple line that brought a rare smile to his face. "I'll never forget what you did for me, Mr. Johnson. One day I'll pay it forward. I promise." As he turned off the lights, Mr. Johnson felt a quiet satisfaction he hadn't known in years. The journey with Ava had left a mark on his life, just as he had on hers. And though their paths had diverged, he knew they were connected forever, bound by the kindness that had changed them both. Thank you for joining us for this story of resilience and unexpected kindness. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more tales that celebrate the strength of the human spirit. And don't leave just yet. Click on the video now playing on your screen for another inspiring story. Who knows? It might just touch your heart the way Ava and Mr. Johnson's story did.